Every third Sunday of the month, the most feared sheriff in West Texas would walk in his cell Block D and sit across from prisoner 847, a man condemned to die for a crime that had shocked the entire territory. What they discussed during those visits remained a secret until the day the prisoner was executed, and his final confession changed everything. Sheriff William Carter was a legend in Texas law enforcement long before the case that would define his legacy and haunt his final years. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with steel gray eyes and hands that had never shaken while drawing his weapon, Carter was the kind of lawman that outlaws cross state lines to avoid. In his 30 years wearing the badge, he brought order to some of the most lawless territories in the American West, earning a reputation for absolute integrity and unwavering justice that made him both feared and respected throughout the region. Carter had been appointed sheriff of Redemption County in 1884, when he was just 25 years old and the youngest man ever to hold the position. The county seat of Millfield was a rough frontier town where cattle drives met mining operations, creating a volatile mix of cowboys, prospectors, gamblers, and drifters who saw violence as a first resort rather than a last option. Previous sheriffs had lasted an average of 8 months before being killed, run out of town, or corrupted by the powerful cattle barons and mining interests that controlled the local economy. But William Carter was different. He'd grown up on a hardscrabble ranch where survival meant being tougher than the land that tried to kill you every day. His father had been a circuit preacher who carried a Bible in one hand and a Colt .45 in the other, teaching his son that justice and morality were not abstract concepts but daily choices that defined a man's character. Carter's mother had died when he was 12, killed by outlaws who burned the family ranch during a cattle rustling operation. That tragedy had planted a seed of steel determination in the young man's heart, a conviction that evil must be confronted directly and without compromise. Over the years, Carter had cleaned up Redemption County with methodical efficiency. He'd broken up the cattle rustling rings that had terrorized local ranchers for decades. He'd shut down the corrupt gambling operations that had been robbing travelers and miners of their hard-earned money. He'd tracked down and arrested murderers who thought the remote location of their crimes made them untouchable. Most importantly, he'd established a culture of law and order that transformed Millfield from a dangerous frontier outpost into a thriving community where families could raise their children without fear. Carter's methods were sometimes harsh, but they were always legal and always effective. He believed that justice was like a mathematical equation, clear, precise, and admitting no room for ambiguity. Guilty men went to prison or faced execution. Innocent men went free. The law was the law, and Carter applied it with the consistency of natural forces like gravity or the rising sun. This black-and-white worldview had served him well for 3 decades, earning him the respect of judges, the loyalty of his deputies, and the grudging admiration of even the criminals he pursued. But in 1902, Sheriff William Carter encountered a case that would challenge everything he believed about justice, truth, and the nature of good and evil. It began with what appeared to be the most straightforward crime of his career and ended with questions that would torment him for the rest of his life. The murder of Martha Henderson shocked the entire territory, not just because of its brutality, but because it seemed to come from nowhere. Martha was the beloved schoolteacher in Millfield, a gentle woman in her 30s who had dedicated her life to educating the children of ranchers and miners. She lived alone in a small house behind the schoolhouse, tending a garden that supplied vegetables to families in need and caring for injured animals that children brought to her for healing. Martha had no enemies, no romantic entanglements that might provoke jealousy, and no possessions valuable enough to attract thieves. On the morning of September 15th, 1902, Martha's body was discovered in her kitchen by 2 students who had come to school early. She had been beaten to death with what appeared to be a heavy, blunt instrument. and the house had been ransacked as if the killer had been searching for something specific. The brutality of the attack was shocking even by frontier standards, suggesting a level of rage that went far beyond simple robbery or random violence. Sheriff Carter arrived at the scene within an hour of the discovery and immediately began the meticulous investigation that had made him famous throughout Texas. He examined every detail of the crime scene, interviewed every resident of Millfield, and followed up on every possible lead. The evidence pointed to a drifter named Marcus Webb, a man with a history of violence who had been seen in town on the night of the murder and who had left Millfield early the next morning without explanation. Webb was captured 3 days later at a saloon in the neighboring county, drunk and spending money that he couldn't account for. When Carter arrested him, Webb's clothes still bore bloodstains that matched Martha Henderson's blood type. Hidden in his saddlebags were several pieces of jewelry and a small amount of cash that Martha's neighbors identified as items they had seen in her house. Most damning of all, Webb's boots matched footprints found in the mud outside Martha's kitchen window. The trial was swift and decisive. Webb claimed he was innocent, insisting that he had never met Martha Henderson and had no reason to harm her. But his alibi was weak and contradictory, and he couldn't explain how he'd come to possess Martha's belongings or why his boots matched the crime scene footprints. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Harrison sentenced Marcus Webb to death by hanging, and the execution was scheduled for January 15, 1903. Throughout the investigation and trial, Sheriff Carter had felt the satisfaction that came from a job well done. The evidence was overwhelming, the conviction was just, and the community could rest assured that Martha Henderson's killer would pay for his crime. It was exactly the kind of clear-cut case that had defined Carter's career. Evil had been confronted, justice had prevailed, and the law had protected the innocent. But 3 weeks after Webb's sentencing, something happened that would shatter Carter's confidence in everything he thought he knew about the case. A young ranch hand named Tommy Prescott came to the sheriff's office with information that he'd been too frightened to share during the original investigation. Tommy had been sweet on Martha Henderson and had often walked past her house in the evenings, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or find an excuse to speak with her. On the night of the murder, Tommy had seen something that terrified him into silence. Around 9 o'clock, he had watched 2 well-dressed men approach Martha's house from the back alley. These weren't drifters or random criminals. They wore expensive suits and moved with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. Tommy had hidden in the shadows, assuming they were there on some kind of official business. But through Martha's kitchen window, he had seen them threatening her, demanding something that she apparently didn't want to give them. Tommy couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but he could see Martha shaking her head repeatedly and pointing toward a wooden chest in the corner of her kitchen. The men had grown increasingly agitated, and one of them had grabbed Martha by the shoulders, shaking her violently. That's when Tommy had panicked and run home, too frightened to intervene and too ashamed to admit his cowardice to anyone. The next morning, when news of Martha's murder spread through town, Tommy had been paralyzed by guilt and fear. He knew he should tell Sheriff Carter what he'd seen, but the 2 men he'd witnessed at Martha's house were not strangers. One of them was Judge Harrison, the same man who had presided over Marcus Webb's trial. The other was David Kellerman, the most powerful cattle baron in the territory and a man whose political influence extended all the way to the state capitol. Tommy's revelation hit Sheriff Carter like a physical blow. If the young man's account was accurate, then Marcus Webb was innocent, and the Real killers were 2 of the most powerful men in Texas. But Carter was also a practical lawman who understood the difference between suspicion and proof. Tommy's story was compelling, but it was also the uncorroborated testimony of a frightened boy who had waited months to come forward. Without additional evidence, it would be impossible to challenge men of Judge Harrison and David Kellerman's stature. Carter spent weeks investigating Tommy's claims, but his efforts were hampered by the very power and influence of the men he was trying to expose. Witnesses who might have seen Harrison and Kellerman in town that night suddenly became unavailable or claimed they couldn't remember anything unusual. Records that might have established their whereabouts mysteriously disappeared from hotel registries and business ledgers. Most frustrating of all, Carter discovered that several potential witnesses had left town entirely, accepting sudden job offers in distant states or receiving unexpected inheritances that required immediate travel. As the date of Marcus Webb's execution approached, Carter found himself in the most agonizing position of his career. He had built his reputation on absolute certainty, on the conviction that justice was clear and truth was discoverable. But now he faced the possibility that he had helped convict an innocent man while the Real killers not only went free, but actively participated in the legal proceedings that would result in Webb's death. The weight of this uncertainty drove Carter to do something that violated every principle of proper legal procedure. He began visiting Marcus Webb in his cell. These visits started as informal interrogations, attempts to find some piece of evidence that would either confirm Webb's guilt or provide clues that might lead to the real killers. But over time, they evolved into something much more complex and troubling. Webb was an educated man despite his rough appearance and criminal history. He had been a schoolteacher himself before a gambling addiction, and a series of bad decisions had led him to a life of drifting and petty crime. During their conversations, Carter discovered that Webb possessed a sharp intelligence and a deep understanding of human nature that made his protests of innocence increasingly credible. More disturbing still, Webb began to share details about his past that painted a picture of a man who was certainly a criminal but probably not a murderer. He had stolen horses, cheated at cards, and gotten into countless barroom fights. But his crimes had always been driven by desperation or opportunity rather than violence for its own sake. The brutal, rage-filled killing of Martha Henderson seemed completely inconsistent with Webb's criminal pattern. As the months passed and the execution date grew closer, Carter found himself trapped in a moral maze that offered no clear path forward. If he publicly questioned Webb's conviction, he would be challenging not just the verdict but the integrity of Judge Harrison and the power of David Kellerman. Such accusations, made without ironclad proof, would destroy Carter's own career and possibly result in criminal charges for defamation. But if he remained silent and allowed the execution to proceed, he would be complicit in what might be a judicial murder. The visits to Webb's cell became Carter's attempt to find a third option, some way to uncover the truth without destroying everything he had built over 30 years of service. He began bringing Webb books to read, partly out of compassion, but mainly in hopes that their conversations might reveal some overlooked detail that could either confirm his guilt or point toward the Real killers. But instead of finding easy answers, Carter discovered that the question of Webb's guilt or innocence was more complex than he had ever imagined. Webb freely admitted to crimes he had committed, showing no inclination to claim false innocence about his criminal past. But he maintained with absolute consistency that he had never met Martha Henderson and had no knowledge of any reason why someone would want to harm her. More troubling still, Webb began to piece together his own theory about why he had been framed for the murder. During his travels through the territory, he had heard rumors about Judge Harrison's financial troubles and David Kellerman's expansion of his cattle empire through questionable land acquisitions. Webb suspected that Martha Henderson had somehow come into possession of information that threatened both men, and that her murder had been intended to silence her permanently. According to Webb's theory, Martha's position as the town schoolteacher had given her access to property records, legal documents, and correspondence that revealed illegal activities by Harrison and Kellerman. Perhaps she had discovered evidence of bribery, fraud, or other crimes that could have sent both men to prison. When they failed to retrieve this evidence voluntarily, they had killed her and framed a convenient outsider for the crime. Carter found Webb's theory plausible but impossible to prove. The evidence that might have supported such a conspiracy would have been destroyed immediately after Martha's death, and the witnesses who could confirm the illegal activities would either be dead, intimidated into silence, or complicit in the crimes themselves. Even if Carter could have proven that Harrison and Kellerman were corrupt, establishing their connection to Martha's murder would require the kind of investigation that was far beyond the resources of a county sheriff. As Webb's execution date approached, Carter faced a crisis of conscience that was eating him alive. Every Sunday, he would sit in the church where Martha Henderson had played organ and listen to sermons about justice, mercy, and the obligation to protect the innocent. But when he returned to the jail and looked into Marcus Webb's eyes, he saw a man who might be about to die for crimes committed by the very people who were orchestrating his execution. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the scheduled hanging, when Webb made an offer that stunned Carter with its generosity and moral complexity. Webb proposed that he would publicly confess to Martha Henderson's murder, accepting full responsibility and clearing Carter of any doubt about the righteousness of the conviction. In exchange, Webb asked only that Carter promise to continue investigating the case after the execution, and that if he ever uncovered evidence of the real killers, he would ensure that justice was ultimately served. Webb's offer was motivated by a combination of fatalism and genuine concern for Carter's peace of mind. He had accepted that he was going to die regardless of his guilt or innocence, and he understood that Carter was being tortured by uncertainty. By confessing to the murder, Webb could free Carter from the burden of doubt, while simultaneously creating a moral obligation that might eventually lead to the exposure of the real killers. But Carter couldn't accept Webb's sacrifice, even though it would have solved his immediate problem. The idea of allowing an innocent man to die for crimes he didn't commit violated everything Carter believed about justice and honor. Yet he also couldn't bring himself to take the dramatic action that might save Webb's life, but would certainly destroy his own career and credibility. The compromise that Carter ultimately reached was as painful as it was unsatisfying. He would continue visiting Webb until the execution, providing whatever comfort and companionship he could offer to a man who might be facing an unjust death. He would also use his remaining time to conduct one final, desperate investigation, hoping against hope to uncover the evidence that would either confirm Webb's guilt or expose the real killers. But Carter's investigation yielded nothing new. The conspiracy, if it existed, had been too well planned and executed to leave traces that could be discovered months after the fact. Judge Harrison and David Kellerman continued their normal routines, showing no signs of guilt or concern about the approaching execution. The witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony remained unavailable or uncooperative. On January 15, 1903, Marcus Webb was executed by hanging in the courtyard of the Redemption County Jail. Sheriff Carter was present, as required by law, and he watched as a man who might have been innocent died for crimes he might not have committed. Webb's final words were spoken privately to Carter just before the execution, a whispered confession that would haunt the sheriff for the rest of his life. What Webb told Carter in those final moments was not an admission of guilt, but a prediction that would prove devastatingly accurate. Webb warned Carter that Judge Harrison and David Kellerman would not stop with Martha Henderson's murder, that their corruption ran deeper than anyone suspected, and that more innocent people would die if their crimes were not exposed. Webb also shared the location where he believed Martha might have hidden the evidence that had led to her death, information that he had pieced together from rumors and his own investigation during the months he spent in jail. Most importantly, Webb gave Carter a sealed letter that he had written during his final weeks in prison. The letter contained everything Webb had learned or suspected about the conspiracy behind Martha's murder, along with detailed instructions for how Carter might be able to prove the truth after Webb's death. Webb asked Carter to keep the letter secret for exactly 1 year, giving the real killers time to believe they were safe, while Carter used that time to gather the evidence needed to expose them. After Webb's execution, Carter returned to his normal duties as sheriff, but he was a changed man. The absolute confidence that had defined his career was gone, replaced by a corrosive doubt that affected every decision he made. He began to question not just the Webb case, but every conviction he had secured over 30 years of law enforcement. How many other innocent men had he sent to prison or death because he had been too quick to accept obvious answers and too slow to consider more complex possibilities? Carter kept his promise to Webb, spending every free moment searching for the evidence that might vindicate the executed man and expose his killers. He followed the clues in Webb's letter to several locations around Redemption County, including the abandoned mine shaft where Webb believed Martha might have hidden documents proving Harrison and Kellerman's crimes. But months of searching yielded nothing, and Carter began to wonder if Webb's theories had been the desperate fantasies of a doomed man rather than legitimate leads to the truth. The breakthrough came 11 months after Webb's execution, when Carter discovered a metal box buried beneath the floorboards of the old schoolhouse where Martha Henderson had taught. The box contained exactly what Webb had predicted: detailed records of illegal land deals, evidence of bribery and corruption, and correspondence between Judge Harrison and David Kellerman that proved they had been systematically defrauding the territory for years. Most damning of all, the box contained a letter from Martha to her sister in Kansas, dated the day before her murder, in which she described her discovery of the corruption and her plan to present the evidence to federal authorities. Martha had suspected that Harrison and Kellerman would try to stop her, and she had hidden the evidence as insurance against exactly the kind of violence that ultimately claimed her life. Armed with Webb's letter and Martha's evidence, Carter finally had the proof he needed to expose the conspiracy that had led to her murder and Webb's execution. But by then, both Judge Harrison and David Kellerman were dead, Harrison from a heart attack, and Kellerman from a riding accident that some suspected was actually suicide. The justice that Carter had sought for over a year would never be served in a courtroom, and the vindication of Marcus Webb would come too late to save his life. Carter published Webb's letter in every major newspaper in Texas, exactly as the condemned man had requested. The revelations sent shockwaves through the legal and political establishment, leading to reforms in the judicial system and new oversight of local law enforcement. But for Carter personally, the victory felt hollow and meaningless. An innocent man had died, guilty men had escaped justice, and the legal system that Carter had devoted his life to serving had been revealed as corrupt and fallible. The Webb case marked the end of Carter's career as a sheriff, though he continued to wear the badge for several more years. The absolute certainty that had once made him the most feared lawman in Texas was gone forever, replaced by a humility and caution that made him more compassionate but less effective. Carter began to question every piece of evidence, to consider every alternative theory, and to doubt every conviction in ways that sometimes allowed guilty men to escape justice. When Carter finally retired in 1910, he was a broken man who had learned too much about the complexity of truth and the limitations of human justice. He spent his final years running a small general store in a quiet town where nobody knew about his past as a legendary sheriff. The iron-willed lawman who had once brought order to the most dangerous territories in Texas became a gentle old man who was known for his kindness to children and his willingness to extend credit to families who couldn't afford to pay their bills. Carter died in 1925, taking with him the full story of his 20-year relationship with Marcus Webb and the moral crisis that had defined his final years as a sheriff. It wasn't until his personal papers were discovered decades later that the public learned about the monthly visits to Cell Block D and the profound impact that those conversations had on one of the most respected lawmen in Texas history. The letters that Carter wrote but never sent to Webb's sister revealed the depth of his guilt and the sincerity of his regret. In one particularly poignant passage, Carter wrote, I have spent my entire career believing that justice was simple and truth was absolute. Your brother taught me that justice is complex and truth is often hidden beneath layers of power and corruption that good men lack the courage to confront. I failed him, and in failing him, I failed everything I thought I believed about right and wrong. The story of Sheriff William Carter and prisoner 847 became a landmark case in discussions of judicial reform and the fallibility of the legal system. Law schools began teaching courses on wrongful convictions and the importance of thorough investigation. Police departments implemented new procedures for handling evidence and interviewing witnesses. Judges became more cautious about accepting obvious explanations for complex crimes. But perhaps the most important lesson of Carter's story was the recognition that justice is not a mechanical process that automatically produces correct results, but a human endeavor that requires constant vigilance, moral courage, and the willingness to question even our most confident conclusions. The sheriff who had once embodied absolute certainty became a symbol of the humility and self-doubt that are essential qualities for anyone entrusted with the power to determine guilt or innocence. The monthly visits to Cell Block D were Carter's attempt to bridge the gap between the certainty he had once possessed and the doubt that would define his later years. In Marcus Webb, he found not just a possible victim of injustice, but a teacher who showed him that the pursuit of truth requires more than just following evidence and applying laws. It requires the moral courage to admit mistakes, the intellectual humility to consider alternative explanations, and the personal integrity to place justice above career advancement and public reputation. Marcus Webb's final confession was not an admission of guilt, but a challenge to everyone involved in the justice system to remember that behind every case file and every legal proceeding is a human being whose life hangs in the balance. Webb's words reminded Carter that the law is only as just as the people who implement it, and that the pursuit of justice requires not just technical competence, but moral wisdom and emotional courage. The transformation of Sheriff William Carter from an icon of frontier justice to a symbol of judicial humility illustrates the evolution of American law enforcement from a simpler time when right and wrong seemed clearly defined to a more complex era when justice required not just strength and determination, but wisdom and compassion. Carter's story reminds us that the greatest law enforcement officers are not those who never make mistakes, but those who have the courage to learn from their errors and the wisdom to apply those lessons in service of a more perfect justice. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of moral complexity and hidden heroism, hit that subscribe button because we've got many more tales of courage, redemption, and the pursuit of justice waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that doing the right thing sometimes requires questioning everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, proving that true strength lies not in never doubting yourself, but in having the courage to change when doubt reveals a higher truth.